Thank you for joining us on America's Roundtable, a weekly program from Washington, D.C., with leaders from business, media, think tanks, and the political arena. I'm your co-host, Joel Anand-Sami, joined by Natasha Sardorj, co-founder of the International Leaders Summit and a former contributor to the Economist Intelligence Unit, and guest host, Becky Norton-Dunlop, former director of President Ronald Reagan's White House cabinet. We are pleased to be joined by Matthew Kaminski, who is a member of the Wall Street Journal's editorial board in New York, a post he took up in July 2008. For the previous 3 years, Mr. Kaminski was the editorial page editor of the Wall Street Journal Europe, based in Paris. He joined the journal in 1997 as a reporter in Brussels and specialized in security issues, Central Europe, and the Balkans. Before joining the journal, Mr. Kaminski reported for the Financial Times and The Economist on the former Soviet Union in 1993 through 1997, Egypt, and your observations while visiting Cairo and the region.
I think it was a good idea last year, belatedly, unfortunately. We reopened contacts with the Muslim Brotherhood. I don't think we should overdo it. There are many other forces in Egypt besides the Muslim Brotherhood, and we shouldn't just say, well, we have to always choose one guy, but it is important to have these relationships, and sometimes you have to back it up with money.
Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah, I think you've made a very good point about the importance of military aid, and specifically aid into Egypt, and over the history of U.S. aid or even aid from the EU to various countries that have gone through transition. We've seen sort of, in some cases, where the money has been spent wisely, and in other areas where it has really done great harm. And it would be wise for legislators on Capitol Hill to be able to look at ways of how they can certainly work towards strengthening civil society. And of course, there was a adverse reaction to any outside influence. But at the same time, if they are independent voices and those that want real reforms and greater economic reforms, I think that would be advantageous to certainly strengthen those voices that are calling for that which will put Egypt on a road to recovery from what they're experiencing today.
No, sure. I think the basic problem, I think one of the flaws in U.S. foreign policy thinking over many years has been that we've tended to over-personalize foreign policy, that we've made things about people. We like Boris Yeltsin in Russia in the 1990s instead of we like democracy. That, I think, distorted our policy, because it was all about propping up Yeltsin, even though he was not the most ideal Democrat, frankly. Same thing in Egypt. We should have, our principles are not bad principles. We want pluralism. We want the rights of minorities to be protected. That's what our interests are, but also that's actually what this revolution was supposed to be about. So we're not there to prop up the military or prop up the Muslim Brotherhood or try and, let's not over-personalize things again. That's really been, it's a very American habit, actually, that you want to put a face to a policy, and that's not actually, it's harmful to you in the short and in the long term too, because it also creates a lot of resentment on the ground.
Indeed. And as we look at the Middle East, Matthew, you have certainly closely followed what has transpired in Syria. The situation has been considered as being very volatile, and it certainly will have an impact in what transpires in Lebanon. This week's brazen attack at a high-level meeting where Syria's defense minister Dawud Raja was killed certainly escalates the volatile situation in Syria. What do you see as transpiring from the Western perspective of trying to intervene, as well as Russia's, certainly Vladimir Putin back in the post his presidency, creating obstacles in trying to come up with a resolution on Syria?
Well, we're not trying to intervene. I think this last thing, it seems like this White House wants to do, and the Europeans certainly have an appetite for it. We've done everything possible to actually foreclose that option, chiefly by making this all about the United Nations, where we know the Russians are not going to play along. And if we don't know that, we need to find some better diplomats, because we should. In a way, I think it's actually healthy to have Putin back in power in the sense that it clarifies who we're dealing with in Russia. He is a cold warrior. He is someone who is anti-Western, and he is unlike mini-me president who kept that chair warm for 5 years, Dmitry Medvedev, who tried to sort of put a good face to the West. You can't have any illusions about who you're dealing with in Vladimir Putin. Since he's coming back to power, he's cracked down on opposition. They just passed a law that essentially makes it very hard for NGOs to operate in Russia. They just want to they want to police the internet more. So you can see why Vladimir Putin does not necessarily want Bashar al-Assad in Syria to be forced from power by outside hand. I think he sees himself as a sort of Assad-like character. He was apparently very upset by what happened to Muammar Gaddafi, because Gaddafi was someone who seemed like untouchable, and then this guy ends up in a ditch with a bullet in his head. I think that apparently sort of shocked Putin. He said that we made a mistake to let the Security Council approve any sort of action in Libya, and we're not going to do anything at the UN to give the Americans and the Arabs and the Turks a green light to try and try and step in. You either do two things. You say, let's be honest here, the reason why we keep going to the UN because we want a pretext for doing nothing, because we actually don't want to do anything. Or you say, we can't let this get out of control. We need to do something to stop the bloodshed in Syria, but also the coming regional instability. Because if the U.S. is not in a leadership position in the Middle East, who's going to be? You're going to have the Israelis starting to freelance because they're very concerned about Assad's huge stockpile of sarin gas and other chemical weapons that he started to move around. The Qataris and the Saudis have already been arming rebel groups. They tend to like rebel groups who are a bit more Islamist than we might like, and they might go further in that direction. So the longer this goes on, the harder it will be to fix. The more costly it will be. I mean, certainly to the Syrians. Syria had 17,000 dead. I mean, that's starting to be a very high number. But the more complicated it will be for us in the Middle East, where we're supposed to have close security relationships with the Arabs and with the Turks, and you just ignore the Russians. I mean, let's just keep in mind, we've created Russia as a Middle East power broker. For what reason? By what right? I mean, Russia is at best a kleptocracy with some old, nuclear missiles. Yet we've gone out of our way to make Putin the sort of the diplomatic, the sort of power broker here. And that's been, I think, the great mistake. But if you look at it very cynically, I think this was probably done somewhat deliberately because President Obama is running on a campaign of the tide of war has turned, pulled out the troops from Iraq, I'm pulling them out of Afghanistan. He clearly was not happy about Libya. I mean, he didn't talk about it throughout much of last year until Gaddafi was toppled. The last thing he wants ahead of his election is to have any kind of trouble in the Middle East. But I don't think it would take American troops on the ground. That should be the worst possible option way down the end. You could do many things between doing nothing essentially now. I mean, having this repeated dance at the UN where you come in with a tougher resolution and the Russians veto it. They're probably going to veto it for the third time this week. And, putting boots on the ground. You can mobilize your navy. You can do exercises in Turkey, military exercises. You can send a signal that you are prepared to intervene, and that's a signal that needs to be sent to the Syrian officer corps. And most of all, you've already seen it, some senior defections in the last week. Their defense minister was just killed. This kind of outside pressure, along with defections, along with sort of rebel gains on the ground, is what's necessary to dislodge Assad. And one last thing is, his removal from power is so clearly in our national interest. I mean, this is Iran's, not to say Russia's as well, but Iran's best Arab friend. He's a supporter of Hezbollah terrorists. He supported Hamas for years. Unlike with Hosni Mubarak, where we could be ambivalent about his departure, at least in terms of our relationships in the region, it's a win-win for the U.S. in the Middle East to have the Assad regime toppled. Now, you want to make sure that what follows is something better, but it's hard to imagine something worse.
If you juxtaposition the situation in Egypt and Syria, and how in Egypt the military played a positive role of representing the Egyptian people in a way in the revolution against Mubarak, and how actually Syria military turned around against its people. What is there a possibility that with what you mentioned, defections and the recent developments, that could change in Syria?
All these countries, Tunisia, Libya, Egypt, and Syria, have been different cases in how the revolution how these revolutions have played out. In Egypt, you had a particular case where the military was getting a bit annoyed with Hosni Mubarak before the protests started. They were particularly annoyed with his son, Gamal, who was encroaching on their business interests. As he was becoming a competitor. He was not a former military man. They didn't like the fact that Hosni Mubarak and his wife, Suzanne, especially Suzanne, were trying to groom Gamal to take over the country. So when the protests started, I think the military decided, one, they weren't going to start shooting on their people. Two, they saw an opportunity to, as I said before, remove Mubarak, cut off the head, essentially, but keep the old system. And the military came out of it very well. They had unlimited power, which they have to this day, both economic and political. And it solved their problem with the succession planning, which they were uncomfortable with. In Syria, you had a different situation. First of all, Assad has only used parts of his military because he doesn't trust a lot of the military. Remember, 70% of Syria is Sunni Arab. The Assad family comes from the Alawite minority, which is about 10%. They've always felt a bit endangered, both he and his dead father, Hafez, who ran the country for 30 years before Bashar came into power. So he's only used parts of the military. You've had a lot of defections at the troop level. So a lot of people fighting the army are former soldiers, tend to be Sunnis. Now, I spoke to someone from an NGO which spent a lot of time in Syria last month and the month before, and she was saying that you would have a lot more defections in Syria from the military if it was easier to defect. That Assad has kept a lot of these troops in the barracks. He's denied them access to cell phones or to news, so a lot of them actually don't know what's going on. And a lot of soldiers do fear, what's going to happen to them or their families if they do defect. But you are seeing a lot more defections, and it's been turned more into a civil war, partly along sectarian lines, in the sense that, the Sunni majority, the rebels are mostly predominantly Sunni, and they tend to come from the city of Homs, Hama, but it's spreading around the country. So in that way, it's a bit more like Libya, where you had both junior and senior people, mostly junior in Syria, defect to the opposition. And now in Syria, just in the last few weeks, you've had a couple of generals come over.
Mm-hmm. And to a certain degree, when we look at what's transpiring in Syria, the role of the United Nations, as you've just mentioned, to sort of a dancing process with the UN on various resolutions, it reminds us, for those of us who follow the Balkans very closely and were eyewitnesses to some of the challenges there, it shows a void of American leadership due to the fact that the European Union or countries from within Europe haven't really said much or done much. There's certainly a lot of work that they have done on resolutions, indeed. However, without the role of American leadership, what are the ways that this issue or this problem within Syria can be resolved?
Well, frankly, I don't see a way. We could get very lucky, and this could end tomorrow, and I think Assad is going to fall probably sooner or later, although you can never say for sure. We, meaning the U.S., should be trying to shape how he falls and then what happens after he's out of there. Because that's going to be very important, for the Middle East. We can't rely on the Europeans. Europeans have much bigger problems at home, and they have no militaries essentially speak of anymore. The Europeans are important partners. They can give the feeling this is a broader coalition. You cannot look to the Europeans to be leading this. That's actually the one unfortunate legacy of Libya, that we thought that, the Europeans can share more of the burden. It was, they took the lead politically, but actually it was the U.S. that did most of the bombing, and really without the U.S. that war wouldn't have turned out the way it did. It was not done by the Europeans as some of the administration had tried to portray it. And I think the same holds for Syria, that people think that we've, because of Iraq, it's very hard for the U.S. to do anything in the Middle East anymore, especially militarily. So why do Arab countries keep asking us to take the lead? Why do the Saudis and the Arab League asked us, in Libya, again in Syria now, to come and take the lead? Because we remain the world's superpower. We are undisputed regional power, and it'd be nice if we acted like it. The danger of, if U.S. leadership is missing, then you potentially create far bigger problems there, because you have far less control, not that you have total control ever, but far less control over the outcome. And countries who are our partners in the region start to doubt your resolve and start to try and solve these problems on their own. I think leading from behind is a very dangerous idea, and in theory, but also very much in practice in the Middle East. And not to say everywhere else in the world. Thanks to American leadership, the world is a much more prosperous and more stable place over the last 60 years.
And on that note, Matthew, we really appreciate you joining us on America's Roundtable. For our listeners, we will encourage them to certainly look up your articles, follow your work on publishing excellent reports on the Middle East and other places around the world. And we truly commend you for your important work that you have covered over the years.
Thank you very much. Good to be here.
This past week, 5 Israelis were killed and 36 were wounded in a suicide bombing in Bulgaria. Our thoughts and prayers are with the families who have lost loved ones. Israel has accused Iranian-backed Hezbollah terrorists. This was a security breach in the Balkans, a serious one. Bulgaria is a NATO country. A recent analysis titled Mafia States, written by Dr. Moises Naim of the Carnegie Endowment, included the Balkan region's parlor state of Bulgaria. Dr. Naim states, I quote, across the globe, criminals have penetrated governments to an unprecedented degree. The reverse has also happened. Rather than stamping out powerful gangs, some governments have instead taken over illegal operations, unquote. The Adriatic Institute, based in Southeast Europe, has warned Western leaders about mafia states in the Balkan region. During the Balkan Wars of the 1990s, the region's ex-communists, corrupt politicians, and organized crime groups stashed vast illicit wealth in banks in Austria and Liechtenstein. Money laundering has continued to this day. The perilous Balkan route has flourished over the years, which originates in Afghanistan, Pakistan, Iran, bringing heroin, trafficking humans, mainly children and women, and smuggling arms into Europe. There is concern that weapons of mass destruction could be easily transported to key European cities and beyond. How can these Balkan countries entrenched with corrupt governments, known as mafia states, which lack the rule of law and independent courts, effectively combat terrorist groups? Without America's leadership, this growing threat of the Balkan region's mafia states will harm American, European, and Israeli citizens and adversely affect U.S. interests in the region. This past week's tragedy in Bulgaria is a strong reminder. It is time for U.S. legislators to confront the dangerous Balkan route and mafia states in the Balkan region.